Welcome to the debate. The global effort to combat climate change has, I felt, moved well past the question of if we should act and deep into the really complex, thorny terrain of policy implementation. We are facing an existential need for economic transformation, but the specific mechanism to drive that massive shift is, well, it's highly contentious.
It is. And every climate policy has to juggle these three critical things at once. You have the environmental necessity, you have economic stability, and crucially, political effectiveness. So the core conflict, the one policymakers are really wrestling with today, is about what the primary drivers should be. Should governments lean on these broad, systemic market instruments, or should we rely on more cautious, targeted regulations and managed technological transitions?
And that's exactly what we're addressing today. The central question is this: should systemic carbon pricing, something like a mandatory carbon tax, be the necessary and primary engine of the climate transition? Or is a more cautious path, one focused on targeted policies, market innovation, and managing our existing energy infrastructure, the more realistic and, politically viable approach? I'll be arguing for the necessity of strong government intervention, primarily through systemic carbon pricing.
And I will be arguing for that more measured, cautious approach. While a carbon tax is, I admit, theoretically efficient, I'm going to focus on the inevitable and often disproportionate economic burden it creates, the political realities that tend to kill these proposals, and the proven efficacy of targeted, non-price mechanisms that can manage the energy transition without risking systemic destabilization.
So, my position is that systemic carbon pricing isn't just beneficial, it's a prerequisite. It's essential for correcting a massive fundamental market failure. Pollution is what economists call an externalized cost, meaning the price you pay for gasoline, for example, it doesn't reflect the environmental damage caused. Systemic pricing is the single most efficient tool to force polluters to internalize those costs. But making fossil fuels honestly priced and therefore more expensive, it immediately makes cleaner alternatives more competitive. It drives necessary shifts in behavior and investment across the entire economy. And we have empirical proof this works. Look at a country like Sweden. They implemented a substantial carbon tax and have successfully reduced emissions by over 30%, all while achieving strong GDP growth. That shows its economic viability. And as the Harvard Political Review notes, this kind of systemic pricing is essential to drive industry-wide change, reaching far beyond what fragmented regulations or, individual consumer choices could ever do.
And I see the appeal of that clean, singular price signal. It's elegant. However, I come at this from a different angle, one that's grounded less in economic theory and more in, frankly, political and social reality. While carbon pricing is conceptually sound, it fixes the externality. I get it. Its implementation faces these huge, often fatal political hurdles, and that just negates its theoretical efficiency. The core issue is the structure of the economic burden. Carbon taxes are, they're inherently regressive. They fall disproportionately on low-income households who spend a larger percentage of their income on essentials like heat and transport, and they can severely impact energy-intensive industries. This legitimate financial squeeze inevitably triggers a crippling political backlash, and the result is policies that get repealed or are so watered down that they become ineffective. Earth.org points this out pretty clearly. This political complexity is magnified by the powerful lobbying of the fossil fuel industry. So we have to be pragmatic. An immediate, complete end to fossil fuels is just not realistic given our current energy demands. Encyclopedia Britannica notes that natural gas serves as a crucial, necessary bridge fuel. So policy has to focus on achievable, targeted measures and technological advancements that manage this transition. It's just a safer policy design than relying on a politically toxic, blunt instrument.
That's an interesting point on political toxicity, but I think we have to return to the necessity of pricing the externality itself. The New York Times observes that fossil fuels remain abundant, convenient, and financially attractive precisely because their true societal cost is completely absent from the market price. So until that fundamental market failure is corrected through a universal price signal, entrenched fossil fuel interests will always have an inherent, insurmountable financial advantage over renewables. If the debate is about political feasibility versus environmental necessity, I argue the policy has to be designed to meet the necessity, not to shrink from the difficulty.
But the policy has to survive contact with reality. I acknowledge the theoretical elegance. I do. But if we implement a theoretically perfect policy that damages the finances of the most vulnerable and causes a political revolt leading to its repeal, what have we achieved? Nothing. We have to prioritize policy effectiveness, and effectiveness is at its core destroyed by political failure. The potential for severe economic burden must be a priority. Ignoring this political difficulty isn't productive policy. It's an idealistic risk. Why pursue a policy that risks immediate repeal when less burdensome, more targeted alternatives actually exist and can be sustained politically?
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the economic burden is not an immutable constraint. It's a design feature that can be engineered away. And this brings us back to the power of the revenue generation. A carbon tax is only regressive if we treat it purely as a revenue stream for the government. But if we utilize that revenue correctly by giving 100% of the net revenue directly back to households via carbon dividends or rebates, the overall economic burden on average citizens can be completely mitigated or even reversed.
That's a sophisticated defense, but I have to press you on the mechanics of that dividend. Can you genuinely guarantee that this incredibly complex mechanism, the financial equivalent of a massive redistribution project, will work as advertised in the real world?
Absolutely. The dividend mechanism is the key. It's the key to countering both the economic unfairness and the political toxicity. For example, if a low-income household pays a bit more for gas and electricity, but they receive a flat quarterly rebate of, say, $500, they are financially net positive. That's because the high emitters pay the bulk of the tax, but every household gets the same dividend. It makes clean energy choices financially rational, and it completely shifts the narrative from a punitive tax to a redistribution mechanism that supports households while driving systemic change. This is the exact mechanism used successfully in Canada, and it's being debated worldwide.
It still relies on a politically insulated, highly efficient administrative machine for that redistribution, which is far from guaranteed, especially when political administrations change. And it assumes the policy stays revenue neutral. But in reality, governments often get itchy fingers and divert those funds, or industries successfully lobby for loopholes, which immediately undermines the neutrality and throws the economic fairness right out the window. We've seen this erosion happen. So if we can't trust the political sustainability of the dividend, then the tax itself just reverts to being a politically toxic, regressive burden.
But if the goal is rapid decarbonization, we can't let fear of political lobbying dictate abandoning our most potent tool. This mechanism incentivizes millions of autonomous decisions. A regulation just can't do that.
Well, that brings us directly to the timeline and the material reality of our energy demands. You argue for this rapid, broad intervention, but that overlooks the unavoidable fact that we need fossil fuels right now to maintain modern society. As I mentioned, natural gas is needed as a bridge fuel for reliable, dispatchable power when solar and wind fluctuate. So if we focus policy not just on taxation but on improving existing fossil fuel performance, specifically through stringent methane reduction rules, which have enormous short-term climate benefits, while we simultaneously ramp up renewables, we achieve measurable, immediate gains without risking economic shock.
I would challenge the very definition of that bridge. If there's no strong, universal price signal making the bridge financially unappealing, when does the transition ever end? A cheap bridge often becomes a permanent neighborhood. Relying primarily on the slow arc of technological innovation or, managing existing fossil fuel performance is just insufficient against the environmental necessity we're facing.
But the alternative is to crash the current energy economy, which is a political non-starter. We have to prioritize next-gen technologies. The Brookings Institution, the New York Times, they both highlight the critical need for massive investments in solutions like green hydrogen or advanced battery storage as the actual mechanism for bridging the gap. This requires investment and regulation, not just an economy-wide tax that might be killed tomorrow.
That requires enormous capital. And without a strong price signal correcting the market distortion, the shift to these essential renewables will be agonizingly slow. The United Nations points out that renewables require significant upfront investment in infrastructure, grid modernization, storage, a cost that looks completely prohibitive next to the convenience of existing fossil fuels. Carbon pricing changes that investment calculation immediately and fundamentally across all sectors at once. It makes it financially rational to build the clean infrastructure. Things like methane reduction are necessary, sure, but they only treat the symptoms. They don't cure the disease of cheap pollution.
I disagree entirely that they only treat symptoms. Targeted policies may offer a far more realistic, politically palatable, and sustainable path to substantial emissions reduction. I mean, consider methane regulations. These policies specifically target leaks from oil and gas operations, a superpollutant, and as the Pew Research Center notes, they've gained bipartisan support. Why? Because they're seen as addressing a specific hazard without imposing a broad consumption tax on everyone. We should use the policy tools that we know can be implemented and sustained.
But there is a fundamental difference in efficacy. A targeted regulation mandates one specific action: install this flare, cap that well. A broad tax incentivizes millions of independent choices. It changes the calculus for every manufacturer, every transportation company, every energy producer all at the same time. How can a regulatory body possibly create and enforce enough targeted rules to match the systemic innovation driven by a universal price change? It's administratively impossible.
Then we have to look at cost effectiveness versus political difficulty. Why should we prioritize the carbon tax, which is so politically toxic, over more targeted instruments like subsidies and tax credits for green tech?
The Milken Institute has questioned the cost effectiveness of extensive subsidies compared to an ideal carbon pricing model. But if the carbon tax is politically impossible, those subsidies and credits, imperfect as they are, become the necessary tools that gain political buy-in and actually get things built.
And that's precisely the limitation. While subsidies are crucial for stimulating infrastructure investment, as the UN suggests, they are ultimately funded by the public purse, and they distort the market without ever correcting the fundamental problem, the external cost of pollution. They're an expensive patch. The broad carbon tax, on the other hand, drives industry-wide competition and innovation. It forces the market itself to solve the problem by correctly pricing resources. That internal market pressure, not government mandates or taxpayer funding, is the only way to achieve truly efficient long-term decarbonization.
I have to maintain that you are confusing superior theoretical efficiency with practical policy viability. If the most efficient policy can't survive the legislative process or public opinion, and we have decades of evidence showing its vulnerability, then its theoretical efficiency is zero. We have to balance efficiency against political feasibility and genuine equity.
Feasibility, in my view, is a function of communicating the policy design clearly, focusing heavily on that dividend mechanism. The evidence from stable democracies that have successfully implemented it suggests it can be done. It is the necessary engine for systemic change that meets the scale of the crisis.
And I maintain that relying on that single massive engine risks a total derailment of the entire effort if the political consensus breaks down. Diversity in our policy instruments offers resilience.
I believe that systemic carbon pricing, despite the acknowledged political and equity hurdles, remains the most robust and economically proven tool to achieve the systemic market correction and deep decarbonization that is required. It provides clarity, it incentivizes true innovation, and it scales across the entire economy in a way no targeted regulation can ever match.
And I maintain that the singular pursuit of a perfect, theoretically optimal solution, the broad carbon tax, risks policy failure due to inevitable political backlash and the real danger of economic unfairness. I think policy effectiveness must be balanced with economic stability and political reality, suggesting that a pragmatic suite of targeted regulations, focused technological investment, and the realistic managed use of bridge fuels may be a safer, more feasible, and ultimately more durable strategy.
This discussion really highlights the inherent tension we face: how to incentivize a massive shift to renewables while overcoming the entrenched interests and the financial attraction of fossil fuels.
It really does. It demonstrates that effective climate policy demands carefully weighing market efficiency against social equity and political reality. The debate isn't about if we transition, but how fast and how safely we do it. There is certainly much more to explore within this material on how different nations manage that delicate balance.
Thank you for joining us on the debate.
Until next time.